It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
We will rip up the bureaucracy that blocks investment. We will march through the institutions and make sure that every regulator in this country take growth as seriously as this room does.
Can today's investment summit put rocket boosters under growth? Should Elon Musk, the man who made this happen yesterday, be here?
What we have been doing is looking at those companies who are around the world who are actively looking at destinations for investment. I'm not aware at the moment of his companies looking on that scale to invest.
We'll cap spending, axe taxes, reward work, build homes, uphold families.
And could the Canadian Conservative Party be a model for the Conservative Party here? Leadership contender Robert Jenrick thinks so. Joining us today, Labour MP Jake Richards, Conservative peer Danny Finkelstein, former Liberal Democrat policy advisor Polly Mackenzie and The Spectator's Kate Andrews. This is Politics Live. So, in case you haven't heard, it's the government's big investment summit in London today. One big name is missing, and that is of Elon Musk, whose company SpaceX successfully landed a rocket yesterday, as you can see here. So my opening question to the panel is, should the man responsible for catching a space rocket between giant robotic arms be at a summit designed to put rocket boosters under growth, Jake?
Well, look, as Peter Kyle just said in the opening clip, I'm not sure that Elon Musk has any intention at the moment of investing in Britain.
But does that matter?
Well, even so, look, this investment summit is really important because the sole focus of it is about getting our economy going again, getting investment in the British economy. And actually, Elon Musk may have been somewhat of a distraction. I don't think you have to be a psychiatrist to think that Elon Musk is more bothered about Elon Musk than UK PLC. So, look, this is about investors who are coming to London this week to talk about how we can get our economy going. And actually, Elon Musk is likely to be a distraction.
Right. Well, you've said it. Maybe it is because of this, as the BBC's economics editor Faisal Islam said a little while ago. Tesla owner Elon Musk not invited to next month's UK Government International Investment Summit after his social media posts during August riots. Musk made civil war predictions and spread, later deleted, false stories about detainment camps. It sounds more like a snub. Danny, is that how it appears to you? It's all about who is and who isn't invited on these sorts of things.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't be in favour of excluding someone solely because of their political views, but I would understand if a judgment was made that any contribution you could make to the investment summit of a positive kind might be undermined by these comments. They were pretty extreme, actually, and I wouldn't blame the government sort of handlers for this summit making the judgment he might be a distraction. So I kind of see why Jake says that. Right.
I mean, it is the government's priority, though. Investment, turbo-boosting growth. It's all about what this government says it is.
Yeah, but you can't really win with Elon Musk, right? So if they had invited him, then all of the noise would be about him basically taking over and being controversial. He hasn't been invited, and suddenly that's all we're discussing. Actually,
it's not all. We'll be moving on to
right, I'm glad.
You'll be pleased to know.
Because,
just so far.
The UK does have a space agency, a nascent interest in space, and clearly kind of wants to be at the forefront of all forms of technology. But actually, it's not one of those sort of critical sectors in which the UK has a competitive advantage. Cars are, that's absolutely true. But of course, Elon Musk has a portfolio of interests. He's also, as we know with Twitter, essentially a media entrepreneur, and not particularly, I don't think, very good at that in terms of driving growth, when actually the creative industries are one of those areas where the UK has a huge competitive advantage, a real leadership position. And it's good to see the government talking about investment in the creative industries.
Kate, where are you?
Elon Musk has talked about opening up more car manufacturing across Europe, and you would hope that a government so focused on growth would want the UK to be a place that he was very interested in looking at. I think there's something to be said for rising above some very immature tweets from Elon Musk and extending the invitation. Why wouldn't you want the world's wealthiest man at what is being billed now is essentially the most glitzy, sexiest investment summit that the UK could pull together? You would have thought someone like Elon Musk could have added to that.
Well, since you've painted it in those colours, let's listen to the Prime Minister, who spoke to business leaders at the summit in London's Guildhall a little earlier. Let's have a listen to a bit of it.
So it's time to upgrade the regulatory regime. make it fit for the modern age, harness every opportunity available to Britain. We will rip up the bureaucracy that blocks investment. We will march through the institutions and make sure that every regulator in this country, especially our economic and competition regulators, take growth as seriously as this room does.
I mean, the rhetoric is strong and clear. Rip up the bureaucracy. How easy is it actually to do politically?
Well, not easy, but that shouldn't mean that we don't do it. I think this government has made it very clear that we're going to have to make difficult decisions. We're going to have to upset people at times. But the central mission of this government is to get the economy growing again. It's the only way we can get out of the mess that we've inherited from 14 years of Conservative government. But to do that, yes, difficult decisions will have to be made. Already we've seen that in some of the reforms we've brought forward in terms of planning. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will be setting out further reforms both at this investment summit this week and in the budget later in the month. But yes, you can't always be popular. Sometimes you've got to make difficult and popular decisions.
And according to the polls, the government isn't at the moment. But maybe that's a good thing, as Keir Starmer says he doesn't care. But what are the trade-offs? Is it as easy to do and commit yourself to just ripping up the rule book?
Well, so far, most of the things that government's done have been quite regulatory. And it looks like the budget plans more taxes on business and therefore more impositions on how the market grows. So there are words so far. They're right words. I think it's interesting. It's interesting to discover that Keir Starmer shares the analysis that many Conservatives have put for a long time. I don't mean with a big C, I mean with a little c. All free marketeers have shared for a long time that the market is over-regulated, right? So that has been something that people often previously denied. So it's interesting he shares the analysis. It's very hard to do. I mean, Camille Badenoch got into terrible trouble by going into specifics, having given this more general point. And the first specific she gave, she got into a huge amount of trouble.
Yes, about
so let's see.
Implying she was cutting or would like to cut maternity pay and other things.
She just reacted to that because that was the first most obvious question. So when I'd like to ask him, what does it mean? I've sort of run Conservative campaigns on liberalisation, and you run into that as your first question. So let's see what his answer will be.
And what will the answer be from Labour? Just bulldoze through?
Well, look, we've already said, as I set out, quite radical changes to the planning framework, which will get Britain building again. Again, that will take time. Again, that's not always popular with certain parts of our constituency and our base, but we've got to do that to get things going. But at the same time, we've set out our employment rights bill. I don't think that is necessarily contradictory to a mission for growth. I think good employers want to invest in people and they will support that legislation. But of course, there's always a helpful tension between those two forces. In any Labour government, that's a good thing. Right.
I mean, the trade-offs are clear already. We've had the example of the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, running into problems by criticising DP World. And then she discovers they're one of the people coming to this conference pledging £1 billion of investment that they then threatened to pull. Jake's just talked about employment rights. Well, which is more important in this?
Well, that was a real own goal, because there are things that the government can probably get away with, and even some red tape it can probably add if it isn't too loud and proud about it. But actively attacking a company that's offering to bring in £1 billion
the Tories attacked the company at the same time.
Sure, and they're coming in the next couple of days when this line is made to bring up something that happened a couple of years ago that I think was universally condemned. But why would you bring it up in that moment when they're offering £1 billion? Businesses have choice. The irony here is that the UK is actually in a great position. There's political turmoil in America. You look at France and you look at the rise of socialism. The countries that businesses might be thinking, I'd invest here, I'd invest there. The UK on paper is looking pretty stable and good. It's Labour's to lose. It's Labour's to lose, and might it just lose it? Because you can make the defence of the employment rights all you want. You might say this is good, but let's acknowledge it is still more red tape. The fact that the investment summit is happening weeks before the budget, when you might be raising tax on employer national insurance, now you can make the argument, but let's be honest, is business going to respond to that, or are they going to say this is more tax and red tape? The timing's interesting. Don't be surprised if you get some really positive noises, but a lot of caveats. They're going to want to see what's in that budget, what's in the industrial strategy. They're going to want to be convinced that planning is really going to be reformed. That's a huge one, I agree. I'm not sure they're going to take it on good faith.
Polly?
I think the kind of investors who are present at this summit, and the fact that they've come is a really good start, they are going to make really hard-nosed decisions which are based on what return do they think they can get and how much risk do they think that there is. And so the political stability that Kate's talking about is really important, but regulatory stability is often actually more important than the specifics of this regulation or that regulation. And there's something about the transition to a green economy or net zero, for example, that is actually, it is a big regulatory change. And the transition costs of that are huge, and yet it's critical for our climate. And so what government needs to do is actually work with regulators, with investors, to actually design that transition in a steady and predictable way so that businesses can go away, run the numbers and actually make decisions.
Just one of the things that businesses want is stability and fiscal conservatism with a small c. So when Kate rightly raises prospects of tax rises in the budget, we'll have to wait and see what happens. I think the business world and the investment world wants to see a chancellor and a government that actually believes in fiscal certainty and stability. And that's what we didn't have under the Conservatives. So yes, difficult decisions will have to be made, but business know that. You know, these businesses are not stupid. They know that difficult decisions have to be made. We've got to fill the black hole in in-year revenue this year, and that means that some difficult decisions will come on the 30th of October. But businesses respect that, and I think are attracted by that.
Right. Well, as we say, we've got the budget coming up at the end of the month. Perhaps there are other areas that the UK can find growth. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, is off to his first meeting at the Council of 27 EU foreign ministers. We can see him there arriving and speaking to the cameras and journalists there. He'll be in Luxembourg, seeking to show that the post-Brexit reset, if you like, with the EU is in full swing. What does that mean exactly, Kate? Does that mean Brexit is holding back growth?
Well, that's a great question as to what it means from a political perspective, and I think there's still outstanding questions about how close Labour wants to get to the EU again. That being said, look, if we look at the G7 countries, if we look at the growth forecast for this year, the most recent ones from the OECD, the UK is not doing too bad. It's nothing to write home about. They're not terribly impressive growth figures. We're going to have just over 1% growth this year. But it's in line with France. It's higher than Italy. If we look at countries that are in the EU versus the UK, I think it's actually very difficult to make a specific Brexit argument. I'm not saying it's not a factor, but post-COVID, how all of these countries have been faring is fairly equal, and the UK has done better than expected. So I think it's difficult to say that this is simply a Brexit issue.
But it is about seeking a closer relationship. Is Brexit holding back growth?
That's a bit of language. I don't understand what it constitutes, really, this thing that he's talking about. You know, I can only judge Labour by what it's doing. It's not going to rejoin the single market. It doesn't intend to join the customs union. And what it's proposing in terms of a recalibration doesn't seem to me to add up to awfully much. So what we've got is a government that says we need fiscal conservatism, Jake put that correctly. We need to deregulate. We're going to need to carry on with the Brexit that we've agreed on. I think those are all probably correct judgments. The question now is whether they get, and you know, an interesting.
But will it bring growth?
Welcome to the Labour Party,
no,
Danny. It's a long time coming, but we're happy to have you.
I'm not making a party point here, but they endorse the analysis of the centre-right, those 3 points, right? So the question is now whether Labour is capable of delivering those things. And whether it's got certainty about them. It seems to me just the fact that it says it's going to reset its relationship with Europe. When we were having the Brexit negotiations, it was perfectly plain that Europe wasn't interested in that sort of relationship.
Well, we're not with some sort of compromises. Sorry, Polly.
Well, it's just interesting. The framing that you don't always have to be popular is something that Labour is willing to face into. And I, take them at their word on planning, for example, where we know that was a massive thing that held back growth under the Conservatives, was actually a willingness to just capitulate to NIMBYism. The problem is, I don't understand why they're not willing to face into any of that controversy when it comes to Europe. Yeah. As Kate says, it's not some magic bullet where if you rejoined the single market, suddenly growth is at 5%. Of course not. But the question of where you secure growth is always about marginal incremental gains, which slowly and steadily add up to real money in people's pockets. And the thought of continuing with just noise, just fluff, just rhetoric in terms of our partnership with the European Union, with the single market, just strikes me as unbelievably foolish. if you, as your government says, care about growth.
Is it politically that credible for the government?
Well, they say they don't care about politics.
I know, but okay, but let's you and I care on their behalf. Is it politically credible, really, for them to start talking about rejoining this European single market or customs union so recently after we decided to leave them, right? I mean, that isn't really that. They can't really do that.
Right, but then what about where you get growth? What does it mean, Jake? Everybody else is still asking the question, what does it mean to reset the UK's relationship with Europe unless you do something like open up negotiations to joining the single market?
Well, look, the relationship with the European Union is an ongoing one. It's not done in truncated one-off summits here and there.
Yeah, but what does it mean?
Well, it means engaging with our European partners on a much more mature and sensible level about how we can cooperate more, both in terms of trade, both in terms of our
They've said no unless you want to do something like join the single market. They're not going to look at things.
I don't think they've just said no without joining. We've set out our red lines. Keir Starmer in the House of Commons last week, I was there when he said we're not going to be joining the customs union, we're not going to be joining the single market. But there is more to our relationship than just those two things. Now, what is really refreshing, and I know that this, sorry, I'll let Polly, is that we have a foreign secretary now going to speak to our European partners in Luxembourg today, who is not merely chasing Daily Mail headlines. Now, that is a really positive first step.
The last one, well, that is not a serious.
Lord Cameron may have tried in the last sort of the dying end of the Tory government, but all the foreign secretaries before that went out there.
In the end, what does it add up to, Jake? Because
that's fair, though. I don't think it's a fair analysis to say that the reason that the European Union hasn't moved towards us on these things is because the foreign secretaries were immature, or because they were some way, repulsed people. It was because they fundamentally don't agree with allowing us to have the benefits of the free market when we're not in it, and I don't see how we get around that.
But they've talked about a youth mobility scheme, and we have said, oh no, that sounds a little bit too much like freedom of movement. We're scared of it. We know, so this is a creative industries point, that touring musicians and artists are desperate to be able to get visa access to Schengen so that they can put together European tours. That's a kind of critical growth thing on something that, again, the UK has a competitive advantage in. And we're so scared of the politics of Brexit that we won't even look for those small marginal improvements. It's all about vibes.
People are understandably nervous about it because we're still playing those politics. And I think we just saw it. The idea that Rishi Sunak and David Cameron had the same relationship with European Union leaders as those who were negotiating the exit of Brexit, that's preposterous. It's simply not the case. The relationships have improved. The Windsor Framework was an improvement, but there are some very hard red lines that not Keir Starmer, not Rishi Sunak, the country set out.
They did set out. Voted to leave the European Union. I completely accept that.
And then the country voted in 2019 for a huge majority
to. The European Union sets them out. Well, so that the European Union has been clear that the kind of deal that is pick and mix, this cherry picking thing, that they won't agree to it. Now, I've always argued actually it's up to them. They could have agreed to it. I totally understand why they don't wish to do that, but they don't, and they don't.
And that's the point. What are you going to get out of it?
Well, if I may, Kate made a good point, which is, and it's right to say that Rishi Sunak improved the deal with the EU under the Windsor Framework. He did that by a hard graft of diplomacy, careful diplomacy over a long period of time, which was impressive, and give him due where it's deserved. I think we're going to see the same with this Labour government. We've been in power for 100 days, or just I think it's 101 days now, so give it time. But I think David Lammy's attendance at the Luxembourg summit is part of that journey.
All right, well, ahead of the budget, a new BBC study has revealed the plight of local authority finances. You will have heard a multitude of stories, and some councils effectively going bankrupt. The Local Government Association have written to Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, saying that further funding reductions for councils would be disastrous. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. Hello to you, Alex. Just framing it in this investment summit that's going on, does that mean anything to local councils who are struggling with their budgets?
Well, no, we've spoken about a lot, Jo, haven't we? The pressure on local authority budgets, largely driven by growing demand for social care, children's services and homelessness support, which is forcing them to look across the board, and they're seeing everything else they can squeeze, from special educational needs and disabilities support to lollipop patrols or street lighting. So that's the backdrop and the picture. And I think right now, councils aren't necessarily expecting a huge injection of cash from the Treasury in the budget, because we have been hearing from ministers time and time again about the pressure on the public finances. Where the government is at on this, I think, is they're hoping that some sort of reform of the local government sector might be the route to go down. Lots of talk about devolution, shifting power from Westminster down to local councils in the hope that, similarly to the investment summit, generates some growth that can be pumped back into public services. But that is quite a long way off. And in the meantime, we're still seeing this pressure on council budgets with the consequences for services that a lot of people rely on. And the point that many in the sector make is that you can't fix this sector unless you look at social care, which is the driver of so much of this pressure.
And are all councils affected?
Every single council is different, of course, as we know, and actually the layers of complexity in local government mean councils are responsible for different things, and a lot of the pressure is coming from those councils with responsibility for social care and housing. And there will always be councils that have made decisions that people might look at and question. Why are you spending money on that? Could you not be more efficient? Could you not be less wasteful? But when you look at this analysis, which has got responses about the budget details of more than 180 councils across the UK, looking at this year, across the board, there's about £3 billion worth of cuts already being made. So undoubtedly, the trend, the picture across the board is that councils are struggling with their finances, and that's been ongoing for some time. And even the government acknowledge, while they say they do want to rebuild the sector, they claim they inherited a crisis in local government. They say there's no shying away from the scale of it, but even they acknowledge that there's no way to fix this overnight.
Right, what would be the impact broadly of future cuts that may be in the budget on council services?
Well, if you look at what's happening now, is that a lot of what some say were the easier choices to make, so cutting back on spending on some of the things that might be considered the nice to haves, that's happened in a lot of cases. And so councils are looking now at things that will have a direct impact on communities and individuals. And this analysis shows that it supports services for some of the most vulnerable that are taking the hit. So it's things like council-funded education, things like materials for schools in some cases. In other cases, it's social workers or safeguarding services or support with adults for adults who are living with disabilities. All of those are being squeezed back, and that will be felt, as well as those other cuts that many people in local communities might notice. Things like the street lighting being dimmed, or the libraries being closed, or fewer leisure facilities, or parks or recreation support. So that is happening across the board now, and the projection is that unless there is some sort of substantial reform or different funding model, then you're looking down the line in a couple of years and there's a £5 billion gap. So can you just keep cutting? The word that's used quite often in the sector is it's going to become unsustainable unless the root causes of this are tackled. And that's things like tricky political decisions, Jo, around things like how council tax work, how local government is funded, as well as the structures of local government. And then that big one that sits behind it all, social care.
Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. Jake, should there be plans to relieve the financial pressures on councils when we've just heard how desperately needed it is?
Well, I really welcome anything that helps local authorities at the moment. They are really struggling. Well, let's see what's in the budget in a few weeks. But in my constituency, the local authority have faced cuts of nearly 33%. And that is devastating when they're beginning to take on even more functions because of problems in the NHS. They're taking on more work in that sense. Another aspect that Alex didn't raise was children's social care, which is a huge issue. And in fact, I've got a private member's bill coming down this week, which I'm laying before Parliament, which just touches upon that. This is a massive problem within our country. One thing I would say is it's not just about the amount of money you give to local authorities, though that's important. It's really about offering long-term settlements so they have certainty as to planning for their budgets.
Right.
And that will be, I hope, what the Labour government embraces over the next few weeks.
Polly, I mean, Rachel Reeves has said we're not going to return to austerity. She's referring to the austerity when the coalition was in power, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives. Budgets have been squeezed for years. Do you think we're going to see cuts to statutory services, possibly?
I think councils absolutely need an injection of cash.
Right.
I think Labour has a really interesting and positive agenda for public service reform, but we're a long way from actually seeing it delivered. What you have to realise is that shortages in local government create cost. They create cost for other public services which are further down the line, healthcare in particular, but also policing. So police spent a huge amount of time picking up the pieces of mental health crisis, for example, schools who are washing the uniforms of kids. So it's not just a simple question of that you can just put the money here and cut elsewhere. actually it's all a really complicated system, and you need to put money into the preventative services that, again, Labour says they want to make the shift to, and that does require you to think about local government, but it requires really fundamental rethink of what that local state looks like. I think one of the really optimistic indicators is that they have put Georgia Gould, who was the leader of Camden Council, and a really radical thinker on the future of local government and the local state, into the Cabinet Office to help lead this agenda. But it will take time, and the only way to bridge the period until those reforms
is that injection.
They just need some cash.
Right, Kate, do you agree?
Well, I think they do need some cash in the way that a lot of non-ring fence areas at the national level need some cash. But I think that's the story here. If you look at what's happening at the local authority level and how it mirrors the national level, this is really unpopular stuff to talk about. But the costs are only going to keep going up at the local level for social care, at the national level for the National Health Service. As demographics shift, as there's more and more demand, all of these costs continue to rise in healthcare and social care, and everything else gets gutted. And you can absolutely argue that more cash is needed in those areas, but when you have a state that is already taxing and spending at record highs, and yet you have school roofs falling in, you have hospital buildings falling in, something's going badly wrong here. And what you really have to tackle is where the money and where the fundamental reform is coming from for health and social care. It's so unpopular, but if you're not willing to talk about that, you are not going to plug the funding holes at any level.
Before we go to, I agree completely. And I think one of the really most impressive parts of what the Labour government have done in the first 100 days is what Wes Streeting has said about the NHS.
What he said, for sure, but nothing's been done.
Well, let's give him time. But one of the thrust of his argument is the NHS has to reform if it's going to get further investment. And he's giving a tough message to the NHS and everyone, which is not always easy for a Labour Health Secretary to do, but he's done it. And it goes back to how we started this programme, which is sometimes you have to say things which is unpopular to get it done.
It depends what reform looks like, right?
Well, if what you're just talking about... Let's see what he comes up with.
Of course. But if you're talking about reform meaning choice, competition, privatisation, which I don't have a kind of theoretical opposition to, but we have learned that doesn't actually work to shift money to prevention and actually reduce the burden on the state. Yeah. So it's perfectly possible to reform the NHS in a new public management theory way and actually do no good at all. And it's possible to reform the NHS in a much more interesting relational preventative model, building on the successes of Camden and Wigan. Yeah. And we, at the moment, have no idea really what they're planning, because it's just... but we're going to do reform. Yeah. It sounds, great, tough, but what does it actually mean in practice?
Well, and actually, just to stick with the NHS, I interviewed Wes Streeting at length at the party conference when he talks about reform, and most of the reform he's talking about will require upfront investment.
Yeah, and look, I think that's the problem, because this would only work to solve the other issues if it didn't require that, and it does. So you're going to end up spending more in order to potentially reform. And unfortunately, our experience is we spend more and then we don't do the reform. So I understand. What happened here is a group of people were asked, do you need more money to do what you're doing? And somebody else will give it to you. And they said, yes, we do, right? Which is not an exactly unknown thing in politics. So I think one of the things we've got to do is think about how local councils can finance their own decision-making more directly.
But look, what Wes Streeting has said about the NHS, I agree, is very brave. And he's speaking more honestly about it than most politicians have in decades. He deserves credit for that. But when we look at what's happened with social care, Theresa May lost what was expected to be a huge majority because she dared to say people with very expensive homes might have to put some of that money into social care. Rishi Sunak tried to draw that connection between social care and national insurance. Boris Johnson and he got into a huge fight over that in my opinion, started the blow-up that Boris Johnson had to experience.
It was during an election campaign, of course.
I don't think that she lost her majority because of that at all. Her vote went up, and what happened was it was Brexit that did it. The Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party got together. So
that message was blamed.
The danger of developing a myth about that policy that means that it's not possible.
Hold on, it was labelled the dementia tax. People hated this idea.
People
do not want to have these conversations around social care.
People, though.
Well, so
so it's a brave thing Wes is doing, but it's a brave thing West Reading is doing, but is it going far enough?
I don't believe that the Tories lost the 2017 election because of the dementia tax. I think
Kate makes a fair point that this is really difficult stuff, and it goes back again to what is a common motif of the show, which is that if this government is going to be successful, and I hope and expect it to be successful,
but a lot of political capital has been eroded already, hasn't it? That's the point.
Let's see what's in the budget. Let's see what happens over the next period. But I think this is a government that's at least willing to take those difficult decisions. What we had in the final few years of the Conservative government, and perhaps before, ever since 2016 really, was a failure to really face up to the compromises that we're going to have to take as a nation to go forward. I think this government is willing to do that and is able to do it.
Let's take a breath while we take a look at this.
We'll cap spending, axe taxes, reward work, build homes, uphold families, stop crime, secure borders, rearm our forces, restore our freedom, and unite our people with common values, common sense, common hope for our common home, Canada. Let's bring it home.
Yes, that is the Conservative leader of the opposition in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, if that's correctly pronounced. He's been touted as the man who can defeat Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the polls, and he has a fan in Conservative leadership candidate Robert Jenrick. In fact, he has said about Poilievre he is the most apt lodestar for the Conservative Party today. Do you think the Conservatives should take inspiration from their Canadian counterparts?
I'm sure there's things you can learn, and the stuff about home building, for example, and his whole style, I think, is quite attractive. You can also take this lesson, which we can all take, which is the Liberals have been in power for quite a long time, and it's time for a change, it's a strong election.
Yeah.
So we're having a whole discussion about how the Conservatives should position themselves that takes no account of whether Labour's a success or not. You know, you've spoken very eloquently about what Labour's going to do, but obviously we all agree it wouldn't be fair to judge now, and we don't know. And so if Labour's version of central leftism is an obvious failure in 2 to 3 years' time, people could easily turn to all sorts of different types of contrary message, of which that is unquestionably one. Whether Robert Jenrick's the right person to deliver that is another question.
Right. Well, is he the right person to deliver that?
No, he wouldn't be. You won't be surprised to know he's not exactly my choice. I've got big questions about both him and Kemi Badenoch. The thing that I find more attractive in Jenrick over Badenoch is that Jenrick is often quite positive about the things that he wants to do, whereas Kemi, whom I find intellectually sort of more interesting and probably a bit more sort of heterodox, is a bit more sort of fixated on people she doesn't like and that are getting in the way of Britain. And so there are big questions I've got about both of them, to be honest. But I wouldn't have my version of that advert with the flag, and it doesn't involve Jacob Rees-Mogg walking through it. Personally, because I think that would spoil the visuals. So because Jacob is clearly chosen as somebody to please a section of the right, so you wouldn't expect me to be enthusiastic about it, and I'm not. Right,
well, the Daily Telegraph has the headline, Robert Jenrick, I will make Jacob Rees-Mogg Conservative Party chairman. You've said what you think about that sort of idea or the optics of it. When you talk about how the Conservative Party should sort of reshape itself, depending on how the Labour government does over the next few years, the decision, though, is being made now. Yes. So through that prism, how should they reshape themselves?
Well, I think everybody has to choose the person they think sort of very broadly accords with their worldview or as close as possible. My problem is both of them are somewhat different from my position. But I did think Kemi Badenoch put in her Conservatism in Crisis document a pretty compelling argument about what she thinks has backed us into a corner as a country. I thought it went a bit far in certain circumstances. I didn't accept the characterisation completely, but I thought it was very interesting. And, to my mind, I found that a little bit more persuasive than Robert Jenrick, but I wait to see quite a lot more of her in terms of her political style before I could say, that's definitely my candidate.
Right, but you're sort of pointing in that direction, but you're...
It's more that I'm unenthusiastic about coming into the election saying we're going to leave the ECHR and make Jacob Rees-Mogg Conservative Party chairman. So then I'm looking at the alternative.
What would you like to see, Kate, in terms of what's being promised and the sort of outline and shape of the Tory party?
Oh, well, it's certainly not for me to comment on who the Tory members should choose. But look, they have to look competent and they have to look like a Conservative Party that isn't cherry-picking policies based on what the current polling data says. And I think that is where the Tory party started to go so wrong at the end there. This is a hospital-pass government, I'm sorry to say. There are some really difficult things Labour is going to have to do to get this right, and if it's not able to do it, the Tories are not in the worst position in the world in another 4 to 5 years' time. But they're going to have to look competent, because that is what the country expects from a Conservative Party, and that is where it went so badly wrong. But I think Danny is completely right to point out that at the moment around the world, we are seeing incumbent governments that were there during the pandemic get heavily punished at the ballot box. And it's not to say that there aren't other factors around that, but the Canadian Conservatives are in a very different position than the UK Conservatives at the moment. It's not to say there can't be a comeback, but these are not wholly comparable situations.
Polly, I mean, a lot of the talk has been that both candidates, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, are sitting sort of on the right, or at least portraying that sort of view, making it hard, perhaps, for Conservatives like Danny Finkelstein. Do you think that is the case, or that there might be a reversion to what some people might call the common ground?
Well, the first question a party has to answer in choosing a leader, especially after a defeat, is why did we lose? And the narrative of both Jenrick and Badenoch does tend towards the belief that they lost because they lost the Reform voters and that they need to unite that part of the right. Forgetting, it seems, that in fact the other part of the right, the centre-right, many of those people in their former constituencies voted Liberal Democrat. And if you really want to unite the right, you might want to reach in that direction. But because the analysis that seems to dominate at the Conservative Party kind of grassroots at the moment and is that it's the Reform voters they need to chase, that's where they're going. It does depend, I think. My assumption is that Labour will find their way through the next 5 years. People mostly give a government another go. You've really got to be awful to get voted out after a first term. And so it really is for Labour to lose rather than for the Conservatives to win. And again, my assumption, because it's normally that way, is that it will take a couple of leaders for the Conservative Party to get through that learning cycle of reacclimatising itself with what the voters might want and whether they're willing to be what the voters want instead of what they want to be.
Well, is that what you were also talking about, Danny, when you say, let's see what happens in a few years' time, that actually whoever wins this contest will not lead the Conservatives necessarily into the next election?
Polly and I do a podcast together, and Polly was very confident on saying, you know, Labour probably would win the next little, that you were firm on that, Labour will win the next election. And I don't think that is certain, because I didn't
say it was certain.
No.
And you said that James Cleverly 75%.
Well, let's not relive your private disputes.
I'm certainly not. I'm certainly not. That wasn't intention of what I said at all. I meant that I think that at the next election, it isn't. I'm certain if you were to move from the centre-left to the left, you wouldn't win an election. But it is not obvious that that you will win the next general election in the right by moving towards a more Cameron position, however much it may be my position. I think that would be a failure of analysis. I don't think that's true. I think it will be very hard. I think you were right to say I think it will be very hard for the Conservatives to win the next general election. But it's not impossible. Labour will get itself into very hot water. The centre will look like it doesn't hold. Labour will look like the representative of the centre. And with a somewhat more unorthodox approach and what might otherwise be a bit more radical, that you could be attractive in a way that I think maybe conventional analysis hasn't allowed for. That's really what I meant to say, Polly.
And one of the reasons that they're chasing the Reform votes is that those votes are moving. One of the reasons that Labour is going down in the polls is because Reform is rising. There's something going on there where these voters are very interested in new ideas, but also fundamentally undecided, a lot of them. And so perhaps they're the votes that they think they can take back. That makes things even trickier, because in the last election, Reform promised £50 billion worth of tax cuts, 70 or 90 billion pounds worth of more public spending. I'm not sure if I got those completely right. And as you said, Kemi Badenoch got in a lot of trouble when she started to just try to explain that every time somebody asks her for more money, she can't necessarily say yes.
I mean, there was quite a lot of evidence presented at the Conservative Party conference that the values of people who voted, some of them Liberal Democrat this time, and Reform, were actually quite similar, making it slightly easier for whoever does win this contest to face both ways, if you like.
I think it depends. And of course, there's been UKIP to Lib Dem switches and Lib Dem to, people who are fed up with that pendulum of left and right go all sorts of places. But of course, remember, it's, extremely unlikely to happen. But the parliamentary parties are now so close in size that only 25 MPs defecting from the Conservative Party, if, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage are allowed to join, to the Liberal Democrats, only 25, and Ed Davey would be the leader of the opposition. Probably won't happen, but it does mean you have to be a little bit more careful, I think, as leader of the Conservatives than you might have been in the past.
Who do you fear most?
Well, I'm not too worried about either of them at the moment. But look, the electorate is incredibly volatile. And so I don't think the Labour Party and Labour government could be complacent at all about the next election. And actually, in Labour's proud history, we very rarely won a second term. So I think from my colleagues in Parliament and indeed ministers and people who work in and around the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, there's absolutely zero complacency about that next election, and the campaign has started now. So there is no complacency from our perspective. I would say one observation on the Conservative Party, which is whatever leader, the problem in my view for the Conservative Party is the Conservative Party. I've been in the House of Commons since being elected as an MP and heard maiden speech after maiden speech from some of the new Conservative MPs, lambasting house building in their constituency, going even further to the right on immigration, not talking about the NHS. I'm yet to hear one mention the NHS in their maiden speech. I haven't heard Kemi Badenoch talk about the NHS at all. Maybe she has and I haven't heard it. That's the second biggest concern for voters. So I think that the Conservative Party at the moment is wayward, a bit lost and disconnected from the voters it seeks to serve.
I don't think moving more right-wing on immigration is disconnected from the voters. Just to give an example of something where we should be careful that, our kind of sensibilities don't conflict with our political analysis. It's completely obvious people would actually, if it worked, they would accept quite a strong
It's the focus, though, Danny. I agree with you, and that's why Labour went into the election, and I hope we'll deliver on controlling our borders. But it's the focus given. How much... Loads of Tory MPs are still banging on about the Rwanda scheme in the House of Commons. People
thought that was quite popular, that scheme. I didn't think it would work, and I didn't vote for it.
23% of the vote.
I didn't vote. The Conservative Party did. But I think it was partly because people thought they couldn't deliver on those things, not because they were not in favour of tough immigration policies or a Rwanda policy, which I, by the way, completely opposed. So,
just before we go, we were hoping to speak to Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, but there seemed to be technical problems. So I just want to show you this in the Daily Telegraph, returning to this theme of the growth and the investment summit. Kate, the Prime Minister's tax on jobs will scare away business. You'll remember in Prime Minister's questions this week, Keir Starmer wouldn't rule out an increase when asked by Rishi Sunak, an increase in national insurance contributions by employers as opposed to employees. Do you agree with that headline?
Look, I think the Labour Party are in a tricky position. They ruled out three of the biggest levers you might pull to seriously raise revenue: income tax, national insurance, and VAT. They used the language of a tax triple lock. That is pretty severe language. To now say it didn't apply to all of national insurance is a pretty big pivot. And there's no good way to sell that if they decide to do it. You either have to say, no, we didn't really mean it when we said the tax triple lock, or you have to say, well, look, this is obviously quite different, or we found a big gaping hole and we have to figure out how to fill it. Sorry about that. None of that's going to resonate too well with workers, and certainly not with business, because when you tax business, corporation tax, NI, it inevitably comes out of workers' wages.
Polly?
I think the problem is much bigger with the voters, actually. Than it is with business.
What, on the issue of trust and...
yeah, because, the business in the end will care about their bottom line. And so if you can provide that regulatory certainty, the stability, and, as Jake was saying, that sort of enough fiscal conservatism to give them confidence about the future of interest rates and the future of us over the sort of 20, 30-year horizon, I think... being able to stabilise the budget with a relatively marginal tax won't trouble them anywhere near as much as it might trouble the voters.
They could also hike the cost of their products.
And basically, if you were to put PM's tax on jobs, my tax is something of a disincentive to some businesses. That would be what's called bust. It would kind of bust, right? So that busted means you can't fit all the letraset into the space you've got. So that's, I think, however, would be a better way of putting what might happen. It's basically cumulative, and it's about a culture.
Well, all right. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much to our guests. Apologies that we didn't get to Lisa Nandy. We'll have to invite her back on another day, on the day of the Investment Summit. But I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.